First, thank you for that. I wish I could be in a wonderful place, and I really do want to congratulate you first, of course, on the anniversary of the Polar Impactful Conference. I think it's really important that we have these discussions, and I do want to congratulate you on the breadth of speakers you've brought in. I've been listening, and I think it's very important to bring together diverse groups of experts so that we can better understand each aspect of the Arctic in order to have a more comprehensive overview. And I think that really aligns with how the US, frankly, is approaching the Arctic region. The Arctic region, as you all know, is at the intersection of a number of different converging and sometimes diverging trends. Climate, in particular, is driving a lot of the interest, but the science aspect is so critically important and it underpins all of our Arctic knowledge as we look for economic opportunities, as we look at geopolitical impacts, and as we look at, frankly, at the security of the region, and to enable some cooperative forums. I appreciate the last brief on the Arctic Council. I enjoyed presenting there last month. It is a wonderful opportunity to have these discussions. So, with that, I'd like to go ahead and begin talking about the US strategic approach to the Arctic and understanding what that means. So, I'm trying to click through to the next slide here. It looks like I might have a there we go. So, looking at why the Arctic matters to the US, but more broadly to not just regional security, but I think global security now. Again, the Arctic has become one mere piece of the global chessboard, and we have to understand. From the American perspective, first and foremost, the United States is an Arctic nation. We have been since 1867, and that homeland defense piece is critically important for the American approach to the Arctic. But I think we also need to recognize with the accession of Sweden and Finland into the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, we now see an increasingly important northern flank of NATO. And that northern flank is now converged with the eastern flank through Finland. And so we need to re-examine our approach to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization and what the implications are of a warming Arctic for our collective defense, our collective security. From the American perspective, obviously looking at the other side of the Arctic, the Bering Strait, Alaska, and the importance of that region to the execution of operations in the Indo-Pacific region really is increasingly important. And it's an area probably not as well understood or as well examined as, of course, the European high north, which tends to be the most heavily populated, the most heavily economically developed, and the most heavily militarized part of the Arctic. Bringing back to the European high north, though, I think when we look at the North American approaches, those sea lines of communications, we have to recognize the critical role of the Arctic for both the GI, so the Greenland, Iceland, United Kingdom, and Norway gap, but also for the Bering Strait. And so when we're looking at the comprehensive American approach, all of these elements really highlight our national interests and our interests moving forward into this rather complicated part of the world. And I think it's important to understand that when we look at, oh, let's see, well, if we can go to the next slide. I think I've clicked too many slides here. Okay, we'll move to the next. Excellent. Look at some tech support. But when we look at the Arctic, and we have to understand that the Arctic is undergoing a dramatic transformation, and that climate change is really critical to that transformation. And so, underpinning this transformation is really our strategic guidance. We had a new national strategy for the Arctic region that was released in October 2022, just in time to roll out actually at that year's Arctic Circle Assembly. And climate change is the key driver. But obviously, there's been a lot of geopolitical change since the 2013 national strategy came out. And so it was an opportunity to reflect upon the geopolitical changes that we have seen in the world and to present the Arctic as this emerging arena of strategic competition. And I think when you look at the Defense Department strategy that came out in July of this year, you can really see that strategic landscape being updated to reflect the realities of the Arctic region and the regional as well as global players that are increasingly making an impact, both for positive, I would say, in terms of the science realm, but also in the competition arena and referring directly to nations like Russia and China. But I think it's important to highlight that underpinning both of these strategies is a United States that seeks an Arctic region that is peaceful, stable, prosperous, and cooperative. But I think it has more of a realistic reflection upon the need to both protect and advance our national interests and work together with our allies and partners to confront the challenges that are emerging in this really unique and incredibly important part of the world. We'll go to the next slide. I don't seem to be able to click. There we go. Excellent. So, when we talk about the Arctic, I think it's important to highlight that this is a very unique part of the world. And as a Navy strategist, as well as an academic, I'm a PhD candidate focused on Arctic security and U.S. Arctic strategy. I think it's important to recognize that operating in the Arctic is unlike any other part of the world in that your first task is survival. And that is challenging. And so when you look at the challenges from the security side, understanding the weather and the climate and being able to survive are incredibly important. And that is where the need to improve our scientific research or scientific understanding of the region so that we can better model climate, but also understand weather and have a better prediction of weather is very, very important. I would say deterrence and defense are much more important and much more relevant to the Arctic today than 10, 20 years ago when we first started looking at this region from a national perspective with a greater understanding and a greater eye to the north. There are a significant amount of challenges, and I'm happy to get to any of these in the Q&A, but I'll touch on them briefly. The Arctic is a very challenging place to operate and to have economic prosperity in because of the lack of infrastructure, the remoteness of it, the extreme weather conditions, and the evolving climate, which we're still trying to better understand. A lot of different organizations are using the science that is being collected by the researchers in Estonia and across the world to help understand what we need to do to improve our capability to operate and to respond to crises in the region. But it's certainly not an easy thing, and it does require that we work together to be able to have this improved understanding, as well as the improved economic investment to be able to improve our infrastructure. Economic security remains challenging in the region. We're seeing a abundance of economic resources, not just oil and gas, but of course rare earth elements that are so critical to sustaining the green transition and green energy, but also critical to sustaining military operations. And we have to recognize that the region will be increasingly important for resource extraction in the future. And yet, that's at a little bit of an odds with the need to ensure environmental regulations and protections because it is such a fragile ecosystem. And we have a lot of indigenous communities that rely upon their traditional ways to sustain their lifestyles. And so looking at how does climate change affect that, as well as how does this increasing economic interest impact the entire ecosystem within the region. Go to the next slide, please. Looking next at what is happening in terms of the militarization of the region, I think is incredibly important as you look at how the United States is approaching the region. But not just the United States. I think a number of nations have started to become wary of Russia's Arctic buildup. We can talk extensively in the question and answer period, but I think this map from a U.S. senator really highlights that Russia is seeking to exploit the natural resources in the region, which those on its sovereign territory certainly it's entitled to do under the international law and norms, but it has put a significant amount of investment in militarizing the region, developing significant capabilities both under the sea with their submarines as well as surface, air, and then land domain. And we'll go to the next slide, please. So I think another relative newcomer to the Arctic region is China. Now, China will trace, of course, their Arctic lineage back to the signing of the Spitsbergen, now Svalbard Treaty back in 1925. It was a different Chinese government that signed that, but China has been very active in investing across the Arctic and the northern region and conducting a number of different patrols with their icebreakers. They now have three, and they are doing a lot of scientific research that is certainly dual use, which will enable them to have commercial and military operations in the region into the future. And I think that should give a number of us a bit of a pause, particularly given behaviors elsewhere. But their categorization of themselves in their 2018 Arctic White Paper, I think, demonstrates a vested interest in developing the economic opportunities and perhaps the northern route, maritime routes as well. But I think it's important to recognize that China is not an Arctic nation, and so we want to be inclusive, certainly, of scientific research, but wary of their intentions in the region, particularly as we see strategic competition really taking hold. And that's, I think, very well highlighted in the U.S. Arctic strategies. We'll go to the next slide. Thank you. And you can see there's a lot of Chinese investment in the region. Oh, we'll go back one slide. Thank you. That includes, of course, Svalbard opening up their Yellow River Research Station in the early 2000s, but also mentioning some of the Arctic investment across the region. Iceland, I think, was just mentioned in the last presentation, but China has significantly invested in every Arctic state. I think now you see an increased investment in the Russian Arctic, particularly looking at the extraction and development of the liquefied natural gas. China has increasingly filled the void that has been left behind when Western nations have left investment in technological development of those resources because of the sanctions stemming from the Ukraine conflict. And I think you'll continue to see China really pushing to get that foothold in the Arctic by investing in and providing technology for Russia, which perhaps is concerning for all of us, perhaps most Russia. But I think there is some strategic mistrust, but we need to be examining what that closer relationship between Russia and China truly means for the broader circumpolar Arctic region. Oop. Let's see. I think my clicking is going the wrong way, so I'll just let you click. If you can go to the next slide, please. Thank you. And now, when we look at the ice curtain emerging, as it's been called, and I think we've seen this name different things, there's been some question as to whether there's an axis of upheaval or an axis of adversaries kind of emerging in the Arctic region. And I was actually at an event in Anchorage last week discussing this. And there's a question as to whether we do have an ice curtain emerging. And you can see by this graphic that the NATO Arctic, 7 out of the 8 Arctic nations are now unified within the alliance. So about half of the Arctic, Russia is still about 53% of the Arctic coastline. There's a question as to whether there is an ice curtain emerging, but I think everybody is generally in agreement that this era of Arctic exceptionalism has ended, and we are seeing a new arena of strategic competition. And so when we look at the future, we have to understand in terms of developing our strategic approaches that this is our new strategic landscape. And while it doesn't mean a reemergence of a Cold War, we do have to look at how we're evolving our approach to deterrence and defense of this region. It is a region that requires significant capabilities, significant skill sets, and is not as simple as just taking any assets that you have anywhere around the globe and sending them north and expecting them to be successful. So when we're looking at our strategic approach, certainly that is factoring in to how we are evaluating the region. So, how do we advance US interests? And I think that the national strategy really looks at some primary pillars. First and foremost, the importance of security and deterring any threats to the homeland, but also collective defense, collective securities with our allies. And we need to also understand the importance of climate change and environmental protection because really climate change, that climate security nexus, is incredibly important in this part of the world. It underpins how we approach security in the Arctic. Understanding the effects of permafrost thaw and coastal erosion on our defense infrastructure is critically important, and we are working very hard to improving that because it underpins our infrastructure to support military operations and exercises in the region. We're also looking at how do we pursue sustainable economic development. And again, I think it's so critically important that we are working with our allies and partners to share data, share investments, and ensure sustainable development across the region. When we look at cooperation across the region, I think that underpins our US approach. Oh, I think I clicked on the wrong side again. Let's see. There we go. Uh, that really brings us to our national principles, which are looking at deepening our relationships and planning for those investments, but really basing upon a whole of government approach to this Arctic strategy. And so I want to highlight our new Defense Department strategy too, because I think it really echoes that national approach, particularly with enhancing our capabilities. But I think most importantly for this audience is that ability to and necessity to engage with our allies and partners. And I would say our Defense Department approach is more collaborative than it has ever been when looking at the Arctic, because there is a recognition that this is a very challenging area to operate in and we have to work together to be successful, but to also demonstrate the shared resolution and resolve to commitment to our collective defense in the Arctic region. Arctic operations are challenging. We highlighted this, but really the science plays such a critically important part to all of these challenges. And I want to underscore that the need to solve these challenges on both the scientific as well as the defense side of things. Looking at the weather, the communications, we all understand the challenges posed by the ionospheric conditions, but how do we resolve those? And I think that the scientific research really will continue to play a large part. And then understanding domain awareness and where we are with that and how we can improve that based upon some of the limitations that we're faced in that region. So, looking at the Arctic in general, and I hope to really convey that the American approach is really that the Arctic is at this intersection of a number of key trends that often converge or diverge in the Arctic, looking at the climate, the economic, geopolitical, and security trends. Each subregion is very different in how it is populated, economically developed, or frankly, even scientifically understood. The European High North plays such a critical role in all of this. And the United States is certainly aware of that in looking at the European High North and that really the NATO's really front yard as being so important to the trends of the Arctic. We're looking at the rise of strategic competition and understanding what different players and actors are doing, I think, is very important to understanding our collective approach within the alliance, but within like minded nations. And really, NATO is continuing to work together, and the US is very much supportive of that as we get to know working with our allies and partners and approaching this region collectively so that we can better deter and defend this critically important part of the world. And so, with that, I think I'm just about out of time, but certainly happy to answer any questions that you may have. And again, I'd like to congratulate the organizers for bringing together so many diverse perspectives so that we can have these critical discussions and understanding of how all of the Arctic pieces work together in this really emerging arena of strategic competition and really pivotal part of our defense posture in the United States. Thank you.